Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today and to have this opportunity to share with you such an important topic for us as parents, attachment. I'm going to share with you today what attachment is, why it's so important that we understand it, and the impact that it has on our children's mental and emotional development. And I'm going to share with you what the four attachment styles are. They're commonly known as styles, but really in psychology, we know them as strategies or adaptations because they reflect the ways in which, as human beings, we learn to adapt to the emotional and the psychological environment that we grow up in. So, I'm going to describe what those four attachment strategies are, and then I'm going to dive more deeply and close the presentation by sharing how we can foster a secure attachment with our children. So, let's begin. Whether you have a baby, a child, or an adolescent, attachment refers to the quality or the health of the relationship you have with your children. Really, it refers to the quality and the health of all of our relationships throughout the lifespan. But for purposes of parenting, attachment refers to the quality or the health of the relationship you form with your children. And it is the one factor that most determines their emotional well being from the time they're very young all the way to their adulthood. And this has been shown by many institutions, including the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child, and across many studies. So, the quality of the relationship that you form with your children will influence the way that they see themselves, the way that they see the world. Am I lovable or am I not worthy of love? Do I feel shame or do I feel worthy? Is the world safe or is it unsafe? Can people be reliably leaned upon? Or I really am on my own here in life. All of these different belief systems and ways in which we see ourselves, in which we see others, in which we see the world, these all come from those early years in which we were learning about relationships. And attachment refers, like I said, to the quality of the relationships we form, starting with our primary caregivers. Those people who usually are parents, the people who are in charge of taking care of us. That is what attachment refers to. It is the need to connect, to belong, to be loved, and to love. The field of developmental psychology has shown that there are four different attachment strategies, meaning that we as human beings have four different general patterns of behaving in relationships, in any relationship. But for purposes of parenting, that we as parents have one of four general patterns of behaving in our relationship with our children. Now, none of us are exclusively in one of these four all of the time. We can have a combination, but it has been shown that across cultures, regardless of your ethnic group, your age, your gender, or your socioeconomic status, we as human beings tend to show generally one pattern among the four of behaving with our children. So let's talk about what those are. The first one is called secure attachment. That's a healthy relationship. The second one is called insecure avoidant attachment. The third is insecure, anxious, ambivalent attachment. Don't worry about the technical terms. I'll explain them in a minute. And the fourth is called disorganized attachment. The first one, secure attachment, healthy relationship. The second two are not good for our children in terms of their mental and emotional development. And the fourth one, disorganized attachment, that is the most detrimental to their mental and emotional well-being. So let's dive deeply into each one. So let's start with secure attachment. Secure attachment refers to a relationship in which we as parents are meeting our children's emotional needs, not just their physical needs of a roof over their heads and clothing and food and education, but that we also meet their emotional needs. What do we mean by this? Dr. Daniel Siegel, a world-renowned neuropsychiatrist and who has done extensive research on attachment for decades, and the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child, among many other institutions, show that in order for our children to develop a secure attachment with us and that they internalize a healthy sense of self, is that we meet their emotional needs as well. And none of us can do this all the time, nor do our kids need us to do it all the time. That's impossible. We're not striving for perfection here. It is both unnecessary and impossible. So don't worry when I share all of these different ways in which we can meet our children's emotional needs. They don't need us to do this all the time. What matters is that we do it consistently, habitually, predictably. So, what are these different ways in which we can show up for them so that they can develop a secure attachment? Dr. Daniel Siegel describes what he calls the four S's of attachment. The first one is that our children be safe, that they feel safe, not just safe from any form of abuse, be it physical, sexual, verbal, or emotional abuse, but that they feel safe enough to be who they are, whether they are extroverted, energetic, active, or introverted, shy, or artistic or sensitive, that they feel safe enough to be who they are without being labeled one way or another, or criticized or judged, safe to be who they are. The second S of the four S's of secure attachment is that they feel seen, that they feel that we see the need underneath the behavior, that they don't just get reprimanded for XY behavior that they showed, whether it was jealousy because of their new sibling or anger. It doesn't mean that we're not going to set limits. We absolutely need to set limits, and our children develop well when we set the limits that they need in the home. But that we won't just see the behavior, that we will see the emotional need underneath that behavior, that we work to meet the need. Maybe it's that they're very afraid, or that they feel jealousy and they had never experienced this feeling before, so they need some guidance as to and some coaching as to how to handle it, or anxiety, or anger, loneliness, the many feelings that our children are going to feel and that we're going to feel throughout our lives. They learn to process them, they learn to understand them in our relationship with them, in the relationship they have with their primary caregivers from very early on in their lives, including in infancy. And so what our children need, again, for a secure attachment is, again, to feel safe to be who they are, to be seen, that we see the need underneath the behavior. And lastly, that they be soothed, that they be consoled, that instead of saying, why are you crying about this? This is not something to be scared about, or go on, it's enough of the anger, go to your room, that they feel that they are soothed, coached emotionally, consoled. Because when we learn to regulate with them their emotions, when we co-regulate, then gradually they learn to regulate their own emotions. And they can only do it through our modeling. They can't do it by being told to regulate their emotions. They can only do it in relationship. It is in relationship that we learn how to handle our feelings, how to feel them, how to express them. And so, secure attachment is a relationship in which we are attuned to our child's emotional needs. Now, one thing I'd like to share with you, and this is really important, is that the brain develops in response to experience. Now, you might be wondering, what kind of experience? The brain doesn't just develop in response to adequate sleep and good nutrition and academic stimulation. It develops in response to the emotional and psychological experiences that it grows in. You know, about 95% of our child's brain will have developed by the time they're 5 years old. So this shows that the influence that we can have when our children are young and really throughout their lifespan, don't worry if your child is older than 5, but the influence that we can have in terms of the relationship we have with them is tremendous. And the part of the brain, and you may already know this, but the part of the brain that is responsible for our emotional regulation and our impulse control, the middle prefrontal cortex, it continues to develop all the way to our mid-20s. So there's a lot of opportunity here for our children to practice emotional regulation and impulse control. But the key thing here is that the brain will develop those skills of emotional regulation and impulse control by seeing that modeling in the relationship with the parents. So it's very important that we model for them the behaviors that we are asking of them. If we model, again, I can't say this enough, not all the time, not necessary, but just predictably, habitually, if we model for them a healthy response to stress, to their shows of anger as we set limits, if they're being, throwing things across the room or hitting, if we set limits in a way that shows them how to express that anger, how they can express that jealousy, what's going on with that fear. If we set limits in a way that also attunes to the behavior, that doesn't suppress the feeling, then they will gradually learn to develop a healthy relationship with all those feelings that we feel throughout our lives. And that helps them to develop gradually that emotional regulation and that impulse control. So it is in relationship that we learn these important skills, not by being told, do this, don't do that, but by the modeling that they see from us, from the way that we treat them when they have their moments of stress, by the way we handle our moments of stress when they see us being angry or us being afraid or us being stressed out. So, all of this modeling is what gradually helps to develop that secure attachment in our children. Now, let's talk about the insecure avoidant attachment. An insecure avoidant attachment is a relationship in which a child grows up in an environment that we would call an emotional desert, where feelings and thoughts and emotions are not really talked about or addressed. The child does grow up in a home in which their physical needs are met, a roof over their heads and education and food and clothing, but their emotional needs are not addressed. If anything, they're rejected. So when the child shows anger, they either don't get any kind of conversation about what's going on for them, or they get sent to their room. Or if they're crying, they're seen as too needy, too dramatic. The child doesn't grow up in a home in which they can understand what's going on inside. They don't know how to address their many intense feelings of jealousy if they have a younger sibling, or sadness because something happened at school, or fear or anxiety or loneliness. It's a home environment in which there is no attunement to a child's emotional needs, really mostly just to the physical needs. The message that these parents have, even if it's at an unconscious level, is that the child is being very needy, very dependent when they show that they want something on an emotional level. And so what they do, and this isn't out of lack of love, this is just out of lack of understanding on the part of the parent, is that when the child expresses an emotional need, whether it's that they want to be held or hugged, or they're crying, or they're angry, the parent tends to reject that need, and sometimes even to criticize them for that need by labeling them as dramatic or overly sensitive. And so what the child internalizes is, what's the use? What's the use of sharing how I feel, or crying and crying, if when I share it, nothing happens? Nobody addresses this need. Nobody comes. There's no soothing. If anything, I get rejected or criticized. Now, of course, children don't talk about this in this sort of, thought process, but that's the message that they internalize, is that I'm alone here. I'm just going to do this on my own. I can only live in this home environment by suppressing my emotional needs. There's no point in sharing how I feel. Now, a very important thing to know here is that children are very young when they begin to live in this home environment. They don't think to themselves, you know what, mom must be really stressed right now, or mom and dad are having a tough time in their relationship, or they went through some hard day at work, so they're not attuning to my needs. Of course, children don't think this way. They, as we know, are very egocentric. They're in very egocentric stages of development, which is completely normal when they're young. And so what does that mean? We see this typically, right? My toy, my mommy, my book, me, me, me. And that's normal. But guess what? It also works the other way. When they feel rejected because they expressed an emotional need, when they were crying, when they were angry, when they were stressed or feeling scared, what they say to themselves again goes back to me, me. There must be something wrong with me, that when I express what I feel and I express it and I express it, nothing happens. Nobody comes. I don't get any help. So there must be something wrong with me. And so what they develop is a sense of shame. There's a sense of being bad, of being defective in some way, because that must be why I'm not getting any help. That must be why they sent me to my room or ignored me when I was angry, or when they ignored me when I was sad. They develop a sense of shame. Kids can't say to themselves, you know what, maybe mom and dad are just not able to support me. They don't have the emotional maturity to think that way. So they make it about themselves. Another important characteristic is that children who live in an environment in which they develop an insecure avoidant attachment is that they gradually learn to disconnect from their emotional needs. They learn to suppress them and disconnect from them. And so the way that they cope is by pretending that they don't have these feelings. And what you can see when these children become adults and, have their own intimate relationships is that they tend to see their partner's expression of wanting to talk about feelings or wanting to be emotionally close. They tend to see their partner as needy, as emotionally too dependent, because interestingly, they tend to reject in others what they were rejected for when they were children. Because to them, it's better to pretend that there are no feelings than to face the challenge of feeling what comes up for them and handling it and expressing it because it's too stressful. They didn't learn when they were young how to feel all these feelings in the moment in their lives in which they so needed that guidance from their primary caregivers. They didn't get it. They were ignored or they were dismissed. That is the key characteristic of an avoidant attachment is that parents dismiss the emotional need. They reject it. And so kids' coping strategy is to repress their own emotional needs too, to reject it, to pretend it's not there. And then in relationships, when they're older, they have a hard time talking about or meeting some of these emotional needs that come up in relationships. They struggle with it because they've developed this sense of, I'm on my own here. I'm just gonna be, you know, doing things on my own and I'm not going to address any of these emotional needs. And these children tend to not internalize even memories or encode rather memories of them with their parents. It's such a suppression of feelings that this is the way that they learn to cope in relationships. Now let's talk about the insecure, anxious, ambivalent attachment. This is just as detrimental as the avoidant attachment, but in very different ways. As opposed to the secure attachment, where you typically meet your child's emotional needs, not just their physical needs, as opposed to the avoidant attachment, where you typically reject the emotional need, you dismiss it. In this type of attachment, the anxious, ambivalent attachment, the relationship goes something like this. Sometimes you meet your child's emotional needs, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do. There's no consistency. There's no predictability as to how you're going to show up. Typically, a parent who is raising a child with an anxious ambivalent attachment, when they do meet their child's emotional need, let's say the child is scared and the parent shows up empathically, or when they are very angry, they can show up for that anger. When the parent does this with the anxious ambivalent attachment, it's because the parent is in a good mood. Parent happens to feel good, so they show a good version of themselves. But when the child cries, if they happened to have interrupted your phone call, or you're just super tired and, stressed and angry, then you give your child the worst version of yourself. There's no sense of predictability for the child to know how you're going to show up the next time that they are angry or scared or anxious or lonely. There's no sense of knowing what to expect from you. What characterizes this relationship is its unpredictability, because what determines how you show up is not your child's need in the moment, but just where you're at emotionally. Your state of mind in the moment is what determines how you're going to show up, whether it's reactively or whether it's empathically. There's no way to know for the child how you're going to wake up the next day. And this in children creates a lot of anxiety because they don't internalize a sense of knowing what's going to happen next. How is mom? How is dad? How are my caregivers going to show up and respond the next time that this happens, or that I say this, or that I express this? There's a lot of anxiety, understandably, because the child doesn't feel that people can be reliably leaned upon. They don't get a sense or internalize a sense of, I know what to expect. There's no predictability, and children need predictability. They need to know what to expect from us. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, there have been plenty times when I have not shown up for those emotional needs. I was really irritated the other day. I was sleep deprived. I yelled. I was so angry. It's okay. Our children, again, I can't stress this enough. They don't need us to be perfect and show up for their every emotional need. Actually, it's healthy for them to wait and to know that we are imperfect human beings. We cannot aspire for perfection. It is first impossible. And second, fortunately, unnecessary. And our children actually wouldn't benefit from us aspiring for being perfect parents because really what we'd be modeling for them is that they also need to be perfect. And so that is not what we're seeking here. We're not seeking to meet their every emotional need. It is impossible. Really, what we're looking for here is that we show up in a predictable way, that our kids not wake up not knowing how we're going to react, that they be able to know, get a sense of how we're going to show up for their emotional needs. Again, that it be a habitual response on our part, that we be curious about what's underneath their behaviors. Yes, that we'll set limits. We can't be throwing toys across the room. We can't punch walls or hit our sister. But in addition to setting limits for you, I'm also going to be curious to see what drove that behavior. What was that need, that emotional need that drove that immature behavior? I get that you have an underdeveloped brain. Heck, I'm an adult and I sometimes lose it too. So let me show some empathy and think to myself, what is that need underneath the behavior? As long as we can habitually and predictably show up as parents in this way, our children won't grow up with a sense that, adults or human beings in general can't be reliably leaned upon. They won't grow up with this anxiety due to their ambivalence as to how we're going to show up. Again, this is the anxious ambivalent attachment because when parents are very unpredictable, that's what develops this type of attachment. And so the strategy here, how I shared earlier that attachments are strategies, they are ways in which we learn to adapt to the emotional environment we grow up in. The adaptation, the strategy here is for the child to cling. The child clings to the parent because sometimes their needs are met, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And so the child clings in the hope that the next time the need will be met. And now let's finish with the disorganized attachment. This is sadly the most detrimental one. It is the one that causes what we call in psychology the big T trauma. And it is a relationship in which children grow up in a home environment where there is abuse or neglect. They grow up in homes in which their caregivers are so consumed by their emotional problems that they can't help but to project that, unconsciously projected onto their children. It's when children grow up in a home in which there's addiction, or maybe the parents are very physically violent, or they are verbally abusive, sexually abusive. It's an environment in which children grow up with neglect or abuse. These children develop a deep sense of shame and a belief system that the world is not safe. Understandably, due to everything they go through, they don't internalize a sense of a healthy self image or that the world is something that they can explore. Let me share with you how disorganized attachment works in the brain. From the time we're born, we have a programming, so to speak, to respond in certain ways to danger. I'm sure you've heard of fight or flight, but there are other ways in which we can respond as human beings when we perceive danger. In our brain stem right here, it's the part that is connected to our spinal cord. We have our reptilian brain is what is called. And in this part of our brain, this is what gets activated when we feel a deep sense of danger. So we can either fight, we can, flight, leave, or we can freeze. Sometimes people freeze when they're really scared, or faint. That's another human response to a sense of danger. So including from the time we're very, very young, we are programmed to, what typically children do, is to run away from the danger. But as mammals, it turns out we have another part of our brain that gets activated when we feel terrified, when we feel scared, and that is our limbic area. and it's the part where attachment develops. And so, as mammals, we have these different parts of our brain activating simultaneously. We have a part of our brain, the reptilian brain, that says run from the danger, and we have another part that says go to your attachment figure. The limbic area says go to mom and dad for protection, for safety. But it turns out in the disorganized attachment that you, the parent, are the source of their fear. And so the child doesn't know what to do with that. They have two parts of their brain simultaneously activating. One that says run from the danger. So the child wants to run away from that parent who is scaring them. But they have another part, the limbic area, that is also saying, run to mom, run to dad for protection, for a hug. And so, as you can see, there is no way for the child to make sense of any of this. There is no strategy for coping. Because on the one hand, I want to run away from you, you're scaring me. And on the other, I want to run to you. And so that's why it's called disorganized attachment. There is no way for the brain to organize itself to interpret a strategy to develop. And so these children really do grow up with a deep sense of feeling scared, of sometimes copying that behavior of being either violent themselves or of perceiving that there is violence when sometimes there may be no danger. They don't have a sort of accurate radar for when there is danger. Or sometimes they can grow up and not see that a possible relationship could be harmful because they grew up with that type of relationship. So they don't see that that could be what's repeating itself. They grow up, like I said, with a deep sense of shame and with an internal working model, as we call in psychology, or a belief system that the world is something that they can't explore, that they are not okay. So now that you've heard these four different attachment strategies or adaptations, what is the most important takeaway that we can take from these four? First, we can't be perfect. Let's not aspire for perfection. Two, our children don't need us to be perfect, thank goodness. They don't need us to show up in a way that they need on an emotional level all of the time. Three, what matters is that we be predictable, that in our showing up for their emotional needs, that we be able to do this habitually, on a consistent basis. And a very important thing here is you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, then how? The first step, I'm sure you already know it's coming, is that we do this with ourselves. We cannot do for our children what we cannot do for ourselves first. And, in a way, we can interpret this as, oh my goodness, I wish I could just have the strategies, strategy one, two, and three. But in another way, this is very empowering because we don't have control over how anybody behaves, including our children, but we do have 100% control over how we show up as parents. And how we show up as parents greatly depends on the level of inner work and inner healing that we have done. You might be thinking to yourself, wait, I do have good intentions. Of course, as parents, we have the best intentions. But then how do I do this? How do I show up to provide those four S's of secure attachment? The seen, safe, soothed, therefore they are secure. How can we do this consistently? The first question to ask ourselves is, am I doing this for myself? Can I self-soothe? Can I do this? And of course, we all need relationships throughout our lifespan. We can seek support, of course. But now that I'm an adult, do I sit with my feelings or do I escape from them through Netflix or online shopping or food or workaholism or you name it? How do I show up for my feelings? Do I escape them or do I vomit them out unconsciously onto others, project them? How am I doing in that department? And not to judge ourselves for whatever answer it is that comes up, but rather to be compassionate with where we're at. Why might I be showing up in one of these four different patterns of behaving with the four attachment strategies? Why might I be showing up this way? What kind of childhood did I have? And why is it important to ask ourselves these questions? It's not because we want to get stuck in the past. It's because we are seeing the past showing up in the present. It's not that we go back to the past to just ruminate. We go back in therapy and coaching, in our inner work, in our journaling. We go back to inform our present moment. Because believe me, the past is showing up in the present. If we're constantly being reactive, if we're escaping our own feelings through different behaviors, if we're constantly reactive with our children, believe me, that's the past showing up in the present. So it's worth it to, instead of just letting it show up, to look at it consciously in a relationship with a coach, with a therapist, in journaling, that we be able to look at it consciously and objectively, not judging ourselves, but just to see where might I be able to grow here so that I can pour from a full cup for my children. It is in doing the inner work that we can most benefit our children. One very important finding that I really want you to take with you from this whole presentation is that we don't need to have lived beautiful childhoods so that we can gift our children with an emotionally healthy childhood. It's not necessary for us to have had, just beautiful experiences, so that's all we're going to pass to our children. No. We could have had any of these three insecure attachments growing up, but what matters is whether or not we've made sense of those experiences, whether or not we've understood the impact that those experiences had on us. That's what in psychology is called earned secure attachment, because in adulthood, we can gradually develop a secure attachment, even if we experienced any of these other three insecure attachments. Even if we had very difficult childhoods ourselves, it's not what we went through as children that determines how we're going to parent. What determines how we will show up as parents is whether or not we are doing the inner work to heal from those experiences, whether we are making sense of those experiences and the impact that they had on us, because then we can consciously choose how we show up for our children. Then we are no longer prisoners of the past and their impact. We are conscious, gradually conscious human beings. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you found it helpful. If you would like to learn more, please feel free to check out my free guide. It's titled 5 Steps to Build Your Child's Emotional Health. The link will be provided by the organizers of the presentation of the summit. So please feel free to check that out. I am sharing the link so that you can download it. Thank you very much.